Recently, China unveiled its 2023 standard map, and it's causing quite a commotion worldwide. The map controversially marks Indian territories, Akshay and Arunachal Pradesh, as part of China's own land. India promptly responded with a firm disagreement. The ripple effect doesn't stop at China and India. Other neighboring countries such as the Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Vietnam have also strongly objected to this map. But why are they so upset? Let's delve deeper into this contentious map. At the center of the controversy is something called the 9-dash line, a concept without any legal foundation. Essentially, it's China's way of asserting control over large areas, including parts of Russia, India, and even Taiwan. This line spans across the South China Sea, covering a vast expanse. What's raised eyebrows globally is the addition of an extra dash to the east of Taiwan, implying Taiwan belongs to China. This move has understandably caused concern worldwide. Dr. S. Jaishankar, India's External Affairs Minister, dismissed China's claims as absurd, saying, "This is an old habit of theirs. It is not something which is new. Making absurd claims does not make other people's territories yours." The Philippines also declared that the map lacks any basis in international law, while Malaysia reaffirmed its stance of rejecting foreign sovereignty claims over its maritime features. The international community is unequivocal in its criticism of China's actions. This map is undoubtedly creating a diplomatic storm. Now let's consider China's perspective. They argue that this map is a regular practice, consistent with their exercise of sovereignty. They urge everyone to approach the matter with objectivity and calmness, avoiding overinterpretation. The timing of this map's release is intriguing, especially with the G20 summit just around the corner. Is China using this map to set the stage for discussions at the summit, or is there a simpler explanation? To better understand the situation, let's delve into the history between India and China. But before we get into that, don't forget to hit the like button. A video highlighting CCP's errors can easily get downvoted by CCP bots, and your like has greatly assisted us in the YouTube algorithm. Back in the late 19th century, the world was going through significant transformations, and the global balance of power was shifting. This backdrop brings us to the Anglo-Chinese Convention of 1890, a pivotal moment in the history of China's interactions with Britain. This convention, signed on September 20th, 1890 in Beijing, had profound implications for both nations and their influence in East Asia. Prior to this, in the mid-19th century, China had experienced the humiliation of the Opium Wars, leading to unfavorable agreements with Western countries, notably the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. These agreements granted special privileges to foreign nationals in China and ceded parts of China to Western powers. Around the same time that countries were vying for territory in Africa, they were also seeking to expand their influence in East Asia. Britain, keen on preserving its power in China, sought to prevent other nations from gaining control. A pivotal aspect of the convention was the establishment of a demarcation line running from the mouth of the Irrawaddy River in Burma, now Myanmar, to the Tibetan Mountains. This line effectively separated British-controlled Burma from Chinese-controlled Tibet. The convention reaffirmed China's sovereignty over Tibet while acknowledging British influence and control in Burma. This marked a significant departure from previous agreements, as it recognized China's authority in Tibet. Crucially, the convention contained a commitment from both Britain and China to not interfere in Tibet, with the aim of maintaining the status quo and ensuring stability in the region. The Anglo-Chinese Convention had significant consequences for both Britain and China. For Britain, it served as a means to solidify control over Burma, safeguarding its strategic interests in Southeast Asia. Additionally, it provided a framework to maintain influence in Tibet. On the other hand, China regarded the convention as a diplomatic triumph, as it reaffirmed its sovereignty over Tibet, boosting its prestige and authority on the global stage. However, the promise of non-interference had mixed effects on Tibet, isolating it from the rest of the world, which brought both benefits and drawbacks to the region. These seemingly straightforward provisions laid the groundwork for future conflicts and debates. At the turn of the 20th century, the British Empire was at its zenith in India. Simultaneously, Russia was expanding its influence in Central Asia, sparking the Great Game for supremacy in the region. The British sought to secure their northern frontier, which included Arunachal Pradesh, and maintain control over the Indian subcontinent, or Tibet, a remote and enigmatic region,
had traditionally upheld its independence under the spiritual and temporal leadership of the Dalai Lama. It had limited contact with the outside world, but that was about to change. In 1914, amid the chaos of World War I, a conference convened in Simla, a picturesque hill station in British India. The participants included representatives from Britain, Tibet, and China. Sir Henry McMahon represented the British, Lanchin Chatra led the Tibetans,
and Ivan Chen represented the Chinese. The central focus of the conference was to define the boundary between British India and Tibet. A series of maps were drawn outlining the proposed borders. The McMahon Line, named after the British representative, played a pivotal role in these discussions. On July 3, 1914, the Simla Accord was signed by the British and Tibetan representatives, marking an agreement on the McMahon Line as the boundary between British India and Tibet. However, the Chinese representative refused to sign, leaving ambiguities in the accord that would linger in the region for decades. The outbreak of World War I overshadowed the Simla Accord, diverting global attention. The British, preoccupied with the war, failed to enforce the accord, effectively leading to its abandonment. The McMahon Line, established during the Simla Conference, later became a source of contention between India and China, ultimately contributing to the Sino-Indian War of 1962. The legacy of this accord continues to exert influence on geopolitics in the region today. The legitimacy of the McMahon Line remains a subject of international legal debate. Some legal experts contend that it is valid because it was endorsed by the Tibetan government, which, at the time, was an independent state. Conversely, others argue that the line lacks validity because China was not a signatory to the Simla Agreement, and the Tibetan government was not authorized to transfer territory to British India. In 1947, India achieved independence from British colonial rule, while in 1949, the People's Republic of China was established under Chairman Mao Zedong. These two neighboring nations, both newly independent and navigating their post-colonial histories, were about to confront a series of challenges along their shared border. The border between India and China remained ambiguous in many areas, rekindling tensions related to the McMahon Line. Alongside the McMahon Line, another contentious region was Akshay Chin, a high-altitude desert territory claimed by both India and China. The initial major conflict erupted in 1947 in the eastern sector of the India-China border, particularly in Taiwan and Nepha, Northeast Frontier Agency, now known as Arunachal Pradesh. The conflict originated when an Indian patrol team encountered a Chinese patrol team in an area claimed by both nations. Heated exchanges took place, eventually leading the Indian team to request the Chinese team to withdraw. However, the Chinese team declined, resulting in a standoff with both sides armed and tense. In the midst of escalating tensions, India and China engaged in negotiations to address their border disputes. Multiple meetings and discussions occurred, but no concrete resolution was achieved in 1947-1948. As World War II came to an end, China underwent significant transformations. The Chinese Civil War raged on, culminating in the victory of the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong in 1949. This marked the inception of the People's Republic of China. In 1949, as the Chinese Civil War concluded, a Tibetan delegation arrived in Beijing to discuss their nation's status, seeking recognition while coexisting peacefully with the new communist regime. Although the talks appeared promising on the surface, behind the scenes, geopolitical interests were at play. China viewed Tibet as a crucial component of its vision for a unified communist China. In October 1950, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, PLA, began amassing troops along the Tibetan border without a formal declaration of war. Faced with this grave situation, the Dalai Lama, Tibet's spiritual and temporal leader, found himself in an agonizing predicament. After careful deliberation, the Dalai Lama made the difficult decision to sign the 17-point agreement, effectively acknowledging Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. However, there remains significant debate about whether this agreement was signed under duress, with the looming threat of military force. The Chinese invasion swiftly resulted in the occupation of Tibet as Chinese forces entered Lhasa, the capital, and suppressed Tibetan resistance. This invasion brought about profound changes in Tibetan culture, religion, and way of life. In the same year, India formally recognized Tibet as an autonomous region of China, a diplomatic move that further complicated the India-China relationship. India held several concerns regarding the Chinese takeover of Tibet. Firstly, Tibet had traditionally served as a buffer state between India and China, and its occupation by China altered the strategic balance. Secondly, India had deep-rooted cultural and religious ties with Tibet, and the Chinese invasion posed a threat to these connections. Lastly, India feared that China's actions in Tibet might set a precedent for further invasions in the region. The Indian government faced a complex and challenging situation in responding to the Chinese invasion. On one hand, India sought to avoid a costly and perilous military conflict with China. On the other hand, India aimed to safeguard its interests in Tibet and the broader region. Ultimately, the Indian government adopted a cautious approach, hoping that China would eventually withdraw from Tibet. However, China did not withdraw, and the border dispute between India and China remained unresolved. On November 20th, 1950, the Chinese government announced a ceasefire, temporarily halting hostilities in the ongoing China-India border conflict. Several factors influenced this ceasefire. Firstly, the Chinese military had made significant advances in the eastern sector of the conflict, posing a substantial risk of India losing a considerable amount of territory. Secondly, the United States was contemplating providing military support to India, which would have placed China in a challenging position. Thirdly, China was keen to enhance its international reputation, and a ceasefire was seen as a step in that direction. The ceasefire agreement stipulated that both sides should withdraw their troops to positions 20 kilometers behind the line of actual control. While the ceasefire served to reduce tensions between China and India, it was not a permanent solution to their border conflict. Subsequent talks have taken place between the two nations, but they have not yet reached a consensus on the border issue. In the spirit of cooperation, both India and China participated in the Asian Relations Conference in 1947 and the Bandung Conference in 1955. However, the foundation for their collaboration was laid earlier, in 1954, during Prime Minister Nehru's historic visit to China, which led to the establishment of the Panchsheel Agreement. This agreement revolved around 5 key principles of peaceful coexistence. The first principle emphasized the importance of recognizing each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, providing the groundwork for resolving border disputes through peaceful means. The second principle, mutual non-aggression, committed both nations to abstain from using force and military aggression in their interactions. The third principle called for non-interference in each other's internal affairs, respecting the principles of self-determination and non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations. The fourth principle highlighted equality and mutual benefit across various aspects of their relations, including trade, economic cooperation, and cultural exchanges. The fifth and final principle emphasized the commitment to peaceful coexistence, underscoring the significance of diplomacy, dialogue, and peaceful conflict resolution. On April 29, 1954, in Beijing, Prime Minister Nehru and Premier Zhou Enlai officially signed the Panchsheel Agreement, solidifying their dedication to these principles. The Panchsheel Agreement held immense significance as it marked the inception of cooperation between India and China and their shared commitment to resolving disputes through peaceful means. Nonetheless, several factors have contributed to the ineffectiveness of the Panchsheel Agreement in preventing border conflicts. One reason is the agreement's vagueness and susceptibility to interpretation. For example, the principle of mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty lacks clarity in defining what constitutes a violation of sovereignty, leading to disagreements about border delineation. Additionally, the two countries possess different political systems and strategic interests. India is a democracy, while China is a communist nation. China has a strategic interest in maintaining a power balance in Asia, whereas India aims to expand its influence. These divergent interests have made it challenging for the two countries to reach a mutually agreeable resolution to their border dispute. Now let's jump ahead to March 10, 1959, a significant date in Tibetan history. On this day, Tibetans launched a historic uprising against Chinese rule, and the Dalai Lama, at great personal risk, fled from the Tibetan capital Lhasa. His perilous escape took him through the treacherous Himalayan mountains. The Dalai Lama's journey to India was a daring escape that captivated the world's attention. He crossed into India on March 31, 1959, where he received a warm welcome from then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Eventually, the Dalai Lama sought asylum in the Indian town of Dharamshala. Nations worldwide expressed support for him and condemned China's actions in Tibet. While the United Nations addressed the matter, concrete action remained limited. So, how did this impact Sino-Indian relations? It strained an already fragile relationship further. India, which had initially recognized Tibet as an autonomous region within China, was now providing refuge to the Dalai Lama, essentially acknowledging him as the Tibetan leader in exile. The Dalai Lama's presence in India had lasting repercussions, as Dharamshala became the headquarters of the Tibetan government in exile. With the Tibetan diaspora thriving there today, this event solidified India's role as a sanctuary for Tibetans fleeing Chinese rule, greatly infuriating China and considering it a betrayal. Consequently, diplomatic ties soured, leading to a series of skirmishes along the disputed Sino-Indian border in 1959, and eventually culminating in the Sino-Indian War of 1962. Between 1960 and 1962, both nations proposed diplomatic solutions, but none bore fruit. In response, India implemented the forward policy, establishing advanced posts in disputed areas and seeking military aid from the West, which was initially denied by the US. Ironically, this led India to seek military assistance from the Soviets, as the US believed they were too lenient on communism. This shift in alliances would prove to be significant. Meanwhile, in China, Chairman Mao Zedong declared, "Nehru wants to move forward, and we won't let him." The stage was set for a confrontation. China chose its moment strategically, launching attacks in both eastern and western border regions on October 20, 1962. China had a significantly larger army than India, with over 800,000 soldiers compared to India's 400,000. China also possessed more advanced weaponry, including tanks and artillery. Ill-prepared and outnumbered, Indian forces faced significant challenges. The Indian Western Command withdrew from many isolated posts, while in the east, Chinese forces surprised Indian troops by crossing the Namkachu River, catching them off guard. Indian forces withdrew into Bhutan. As the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded, the world's attention shifted, allowing China to press its advantage. Thousands of Chinese troops attacked Indian positions, leading to further territorial gains. The Indian government found itself unprepared for the sudden attack and struggled to mount an effective defense during the war. The conflict inflicted a heavy toll on both sides, resulting in numerous casualties and prisoners of war. The harsh winter conditions in the Himalayas compounded the challenges faced by both armies. Repeated negotiations failed to yield results, prompting India to declare a national emergency. Support from the US and UK arrived in the form of military aid. Fighting resumed in November, but it became evident that the Chinese were prepared to withdraw to their original control lines. Finally, on November 19, 1962, a unilateral ceasefire was declared, bringing an end to the Sino-Indian War. China secured a significant expanse of territory from India, including the entire Akshay Chin region. The war constituted a major humiliation for India, leading to the severance of diplomatic ties and fostering mistrust that endured for years. India embarked on a path of military modernization and nuclear development, and the war strained India's relationship with Pakistan. 2.5 decades later, in 1987, tensions flared once more, this time in the remote Sumdurong Chu region of Arunachal Pradesh. The standoff was sparked by a Chinese construction project aimed at establishing a helipad and other infrastructure in the Sumdurong Chu Valley, which India perceived as an encroachment on its territory. This region held strategic importance due to its proximity to the tri-junction of India, China, and Bhutan. India interpreted China's actions as an attempt to bolster its position in the region. The confrontation was intense, but non-lethal, with both sides resorting to fists and makeshift weapons, avoiding fatalities but conveying a clear message. As tensions escalated, both countries deployed troops and increased their military presence in the area. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi initiated diplomatic efforts to prevent further escalation. Diplomats from both nations convened in Beijing to seek a peaceful resolution, averting an all-out conflict. After weeks of intense negotiations, an agreement was reached for both sides to withdraw their troops from the valley, averting a full-scale war. In the early 1990s, India and China faced a pivotal moment in their bilateral relationship, particularly concerning their disputed border regions. Over the years, sporadic disputes had resulted in military clashes and prolonged standoffs. In an effort to prevent further escalation and promote peaceful coexistence, both nations embarked on a diplomatic endeavor that culminated in the signing of the Agreement on Maintaining Peace and Tranquility along the Line of Actual Control, LAC, in the India-China border regions in September 1993. This agreement comprised 9 articles that outlined following commitments. Maintaining the status quo. Both nations agreed to maintain the status quo along the Line of Actual Control, LAC, until a final settlement of the boundary issue was achieved. Reducing military forces. Both countries committed to reducing their military forces along the LAC to minimal levels consistent with friendly and neighborly relations. Limiting military exercises. Both nations agreed not to conduct military exercises involving more than one division in close proximity to the LAC. Notification of military exercises. Both countries committed to notifying each other of military exercises involving more than one brigade along the LAC. Establishing a working mechanism. Both nations agreed to establish a working mechanism for consultation and coordination on border affairs. Peaceful dispute. Resolution. Both countries committed to resolving any disputes arising from the agreement's implementation through peaceful means. The 1993 agreement marked a significant advancement in India-China relations and helped reduce tensions that had persisted since the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Despite its significance, the 1993 agreement faced implementation challenges. One issue was the lack of a precise definition of the Line of Actual Control, LAC, leading to ambiguity about the actual border's location. Additionally, the agreement did not address the dispute over the Akshay-Chin region. As the world transitioned from the Cold War era to a new global order in 1996, geopolitical shifts and emerging security challenges abounded. The dissolution of the Soviet Union had given rise to new regional dynamics and threats, prompting many nations to seek ways to reduce tensions and prevent conflicts through confidence-building measures, CBMs. But what are confidence-building measures, CBMs? Essentially, CBMs are diplomatic, military, or political actions taken by states to build trust, reduce misunderstandings, and prevent unintended escalations. These measures can encompass various forms, from arms control agreements to crisis communication mechanisms and transparency measures. In 1996, regions worldwide saw the adoption of CBMs as a strategy to address distinct security issues and promote peace. Notably, India and China jointly embraced a series of CBMs designed to prevent miscommunications and reduce the potential for armed conflict along the Line of Actual Control, LAC. One of the most significant CBMs was the establishment of a joint working group, JWG, to engage in discussions about border matters. The JWG played a crucial role in fostering trust and facilitating dialogue between the two nations. So, how did these CBMs impact the situation on the ground? The confidence-building measures, CBMs, achieved success in reducing the number of border incidents and facilitating smoother communication between India and China. However, in 2013, a standoff occurred in the Daulat Beg Oldi, DBO area. Approximately 1.5 decades later, on April 15, 2013, approximately 40 soldiers from the People's Liberation Army, PLA, of China intruded into Indian territory, advancing about 20 kilometers into the Daulat Begoldi (DBO) region of Ladakh. DBO holds historical significance as a campsite on the ancient trade route connecting Ladakh to the Tarim Basin in Xinjiang Province, western China. DBO also serves as an important military base for the Indian Army. Given the vast and uninhabited nature of the area, the Chinese troops were able to establish their tents without detection. When Indian patrol teams discovered these tents, they raised objections to the Chinese presence on Indian soil, but the PLA soldiers refused to withdraw. Subsequently, troops from the Indo-Tibetan Border Police (ITBP) were dispatched to the site. An equal number of ITBP soldiers set up their tents approximately 300 meters from the Chinese troops. China contended that its troops were positioned on its side of the border, while India disputed this claim. Diplomatic channels were opened, and negotiators engaged in extensive discussions. Officials from the Ministry of External Affairs contacted their Chinese counterparts, and the Indian ambassador to China at the time, S. Shashank, made 2 visits to the Chinese Foreign Office in Beijing. Ultimately, a series of flag meetings between local commanders from both sides occurred, leading to the resolution of the Daulat Begoldi standoff after 3 weeks. In the same year, the 2013 Chumar standoff unfolded. Shortly after Chinese troops withdrew from Daulat Begoldi, they reappeared in the Chumar area of Ladakh. Local patrol teams reported the presence of approximately 300 PLA troops camping in Chumar. Chinese troops raised objections to tin shed structures erected by the Indian forces, claiming that, as per the agreement reached during the previous standoff, India was supposed to dismantle these tin sheds, which the PLA referred to as bunkers. Chumar, located in the Ladakh region of Jammu and Kashmir bordering Himachal Pradesh, has been a point of contention between India and China, with China asserting its territorial claims over the area. Chinese troops had been periodically flying helicopters into the Spangur area, adjacent to Chumar, almost every year. In this instance, troops once again set up tents on the ground, sparking diplomatic discussions. S. Jaishankar played a pivotal role in restoring the status quo. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang was scheduled to visit India on May 19th of that year, and in light of his impending visit, diplomatic negotiations produced positive outcomes. Chinese troops dismantled their tents on May 5th, and Indian forces subsequently removed their tin sheds. Flag meetings were held on May 6th, and the Chumar standoff was successfully resolved within 21 days, with China agreeing to allow Indian troops to patrol the areas. Before the 2014 Demchok standoff, tensions flared on September 10, 2014, as Indian patrol teams discovered that Chinese troops had brought heavy machinery to construct a road within Indian territory. Objecting to this, Indian forces moved to camp opposite the Chinese troops. Demchok is situated in the same Chumar region. According to the 2011 census of India, Demchok comprises 31 households with a total population of 78 individuals. However, China asserts that Demchok falls under the jurisdiction of the autonomous Tibet region. The Demchok standoff persisted even as Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping signed 12 agreements on September 18th. It became evident that Modi had discussed the issue with Jinping, who expressed discomfort regarding the Chinese forces' incursion. Jinping reportedly provided assurances to Modi during their talks, ultimately leading to the resolution of the Demchok standoff. However, it took another week for the Chinese forces to withdraw, following a meeting between External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj and her Chinese counterpart in New York on September 26th. Finally, after 20 days, PLA troops withdrew to their pre-September 10th positions. The 2017 Doklam standoff commenced on June 16, 2017, following Bhutan's objection to Chinese road construction in the disputed area. The Doklam Plateau is a contested region situated between Bhutan and China, with the two countries having engaged in 24 rounds of talks to resolve border disputes in 3 areas, including Doklam. In response to Bhutan's request, Indian troops arrived at the site of the road construction and halted Chinese activities. This led to physical confrontations between soldiers, as captured in widely circulated videos. Subsequently, troops from both sides positioned themselves approximately 150 meters apart at Doklam. The Galwan Valley clash in 2020 overshadowed all previous incidents and emerged as a significantly more significant and critical development. The Galwan Valley, situated in the Ladakh region of India, holds strategic importance for both India and China, serving as a disputed border area where tensions had been simmering for months. Along the line of actual control, LAC, tensions had been escalating, with skirmishes and face-offs becoming more frequent despite ongoing diplomatic talks. On the night of June 15, 2020, a violent confrontation erupted between Indian and Chinese troops in the Galwan Valley. The confrontation began when Indian soldiers attempted to dismantle a Chinese encampment. The battle was brutal and intense, with combatants resorting to fists, rocks, and improvised weapons. The extreme altitude and challenging terrain further compounded the difficulties faced by both sides. The confrontation resulted in numerous casualties on both sides, with India confirming the loss of 20 soldiers in the combat. While China acknowledged casualties, it did not disclose specific figures. However, reports from the Russian news agency TASS indicated a significantly higher number, suggesting that 45 Chinese soldiers had perished. In the aftermath of the violent clash, both countries engaged in diplomatic talks and negotiations to de-escalate the situation. Eventually, an agreement on a disengagement process was reached, leading to the withdrawal of troops from specific flashpoints along the LAC. By August 2022, after numerous rounds of talks, the two nations convened for their 15th round of discussions. While there was a sense of déjà vu, there was also a shared understanding that both sides needed to continue the dialogue to address the underlying issues and maintain peace along the border. China's border disputes extend beyond India, and it's important to note that China shares its borders with 15 neighboring countries, with border disputes involving 14 of those neighbors. Among these disputes, the most significant ones are with Russia. China claims control over the Russian-controlled territory of the Argun River and the Ussuri River, Vietnam. China asserts its claims over the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands. Japan. China lays claim to the Senkaku Islands. Mongolia. China asserts control over a small area of territory in the northern region of Mongolia. This expansionist mindset is deeply rooted in Chinese nationalism ideology, which perceives China as a great power that has suffered historical humiliations at the hands of foreign powers. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, sees it as its mission to restore China to its rightful position as a leading global power. Furthermore, the CCP's expansionist policies are driven by its pursuit of natural resources and strategic territories. China's rapidly growing economy requires access to vital resources like oil, gas, and minerals. Additionally, China seeks control over key strategic waterways, such as the South China Sea. Regarding China's territorial ambitions, there is no unanimous consensus. Some argue that China's border disputes are historical and that the country does not intend to use force to resolve them. Conversely, others point to recent actions, such as the publication of a new map that includes disputed territories, as evidence of China's expansionist intentions. This new map is part of China's efforts to assert its claims over disputed areas. China has also bolstered its military presence in the South China Sea and conducted assertive maritime patrols, raising concerns about its regional power expansion. The future of the South China Sea remains uncertain, but the publication of this new map indicates that China is adopting a more assertive approach to its territorial claims.